American government students, I hope things are going well for each and all of you. Even though I'm not there, have been certainly been thinking of you, putting in your grades, thinking about hoping that things are going well for you and for your family. So you can see now we're transitioning to some stuff that it just didn't fit right with in terms of what we had to do and the time that we had to do it. So as much as I wish we could have done this before the election, it'll still be nice for us to kind of go back and use the election that we just had and learn a good number of the stuff that deals with elections and voting in the United States. Types of public opinion. All right, so go ahead and get this stuff down. Mr. Wood, feel free to pause this so the students can get this information. And then certainly feel free to pause it so that the kids can go over the examples that are in their packets. So when we look at types of public opinions, we're going to take a look at three different types. Consensus. And sometimes when we think about consensus, we think about, well, everybody, it's unanimous. When we talk about political consensus, we're seeing that that number is quite a bit smaller than 100%. Political folks out there tend to show the number of 60%, 6 out of 10, as what we would call a political consensus. So a fairly strong agreement on something. And in this diverse political climate that you and I are living in, to get 6 out of 10 to agree on something, you can see how that could be seen as a consensus today. Divisive opinions. So you can see that when you look at examples, you're going to see people that are in favor and not in favor nearly equal. All right, so it's very balanced. It's very divisive. You've got people on both sides. The third one there, non-opinion. So we just don't have enough opinion yet on the issue. For example, let's take a look at the COVID vaccine that they have now tested seemingly over 40,000 people. It's having a lot of success. It's hopefully going to be great and wonderful. So a question like, what is your overall belief in the effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccine? Well, duh. Only 44,000 out of 307 million people have had it. So you're not going to have an opinion on it yet because it's not, as to borrow a fruit term, it's not ripened yet. We just don't have enough information yet on that issue. As we transition to look at where our political feelings come from, this is the term that we'll take some time to look at. Political socialization. So this is where we are socialized politically. And I don't think that this is going to surprise you very much. The primary places where it comes from is from our family, from our parents. So a good number of you can think about how you feel the same way as your parents. Now, certainly that's not all of you, but I would imagine a good number of you probably share at least some of the political views of your parents. And then the media. This is a growing one. This is one that we continue to see evolve and change in terms of where we get our media from. And certainly with you get a lot of your media from social media. So you really have to, and we're going to have a whole chapter on this at the beginning of the year, you really have to be careful where you get it. You really have to have your head on a swivel, so to speak, to really be focused in on where is this coming from? Is it accurate? Why is this person giving me potentially this information? Do they have bias? All those different sorts of things. History and political socialization. So we have two different things that political scientists have taken a look at in terms of history and its past and how it influences us. The first is looking at someone's life. And you can use that top right chart to kind of see that. If you focus on the dark green and just kind of see, you don't have to focus on the numbers, but you can just kind of see as it trends kind of upward, that is the older a person gets, the more likely they are to be a Republican. All right? So this was from a few years ago, so you can see people in their teens, at least what came from this Gallup poll, it wasn't very high, but as people aged, you can see that dark green line starting to increase. And what the life cycle effect would say is that as people age, they tend to become more conservative. So in some ways, they tend to become a bit more able to identify with Republicans. Does that mean that every single old person is a Republican? No. No, and I'll give you an example here in a second with generational effect. But this is one of those things that political scientists like to take a look at, and they've seen some traction with. The older a person is, the more conservative they tend to be. Generational effect. So this is looking more so at something happening in a person's life that has had a big impact upon their beliefs. All right, so Mr. Wood, feel free to pause it here and talk about how you could feel about your personal generational effect. I know I will give the example of my grandmother, who is 92 years old. So she was born in the 1930s. And her first political beliefs grew and centered on the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR, classic liberal, classic Democrat. And I'll tell you this, from that time during World War II until now, my grandmother has been a classic liberal Democratic voter. All right. So she does not live by this life cycle effect. All right. She has not become more conservative in her age. She has been more impacted by generational effect. All right. And proudly, a week ago, told us that she voted for Joe Biden. So again, that tying back to that generational effect, and I have a good feeling she's voted for a lot of Democrats for president over her lifetime. All right. Versus my mother, just to give another example, generational effect, all right? Growing up during the time of Reagan, so very much a Reagan lover, enjoys Fox News, likes conservatives, has very conservative beliefs. So my mother, very much a Republican. So you can imagine my mother and my grandmother do not talk politics a whole lot. Voter turnout. So now we're transitioning to take a look at voter turnout. All right. So you can see there, I've kind of got some negativity towards the United States. I think that as you'll see some later slides, we're doing better. We continue to do better in these areas, but historically, if you take a look at that chart compared to us and other nations, our voter turnout has hovered in the 50s. Okay, so we'll see how that's changed. But you can see that as you write down some of these issues, struggle for voting rights. It certainly has been for a number of demographic groups. It certainly continues to be. We have among the lowest turnouts among democracies in the world. I'll kind of throw that with a caveat because some nations make it sort of mandatory for them to vote or they can get taxed. And as you've seen firsthand, number 3 there, the states, reserve powers, they can set up their elections any way they want. So this is kind of confusing to Americans with this lack of uniformity. All right. Factors in voting. All right. So when, all right, Americans tend to, and you'll see a chart on this here in a second, we tend to show up more in presidential years and non-presidential years, as they call them, midterms. Americans don't typically tend to show up. So it's kind of this roller coaster ride of Americans and voting. All right, so let's take a look at the next slide here. What you can see here is that up and down, that ebb and flow. What we can then focus on is on that right side there. You can see in 2014, it was a midterm, so only 37% of Americans showed up. 2016, the election of Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, 61%. So you can see that jump. 2018, you can see that dip, but it was still better than the last midterm, 2014. And what I've gathered so far, I'm seeing numbers up near around 70%, some record turnout in the United States. So awesome in terms of voter turnout in 2020, and hopefully we can keep that momentum going forward. Who shows up to vote? Who shows up to vote? All right. So you can see age and education have a huge impact. The older someone is, the more likely they are to vote. The younger someone is, the less likely they are to vote. And that's something that I'll be pressing upon you to work on, to be engaged, to vote, to see the importance of elections, even at a young age. You can also see the same thing with education. The more educated someone is, the more likely they are to vote. The less educated someone is, the less likely they are to vote. So let's take a look at this question. Looks like if you want to pause it here, Mr. Wood, and have the kids take a look at that and then start it back up again, I'll give the answer. The answer there for 10 is E. Senior citizens more likely to vote than college students. All right, and you can see that here. I mean, look at how on the left there, we're looking at age. 75-year-olds voting 70% of the time. Your demographic you'll be joining, it's hovers somewhere between 40 and 50. On the right-hand side, you can see as people have more advanced degrees, the more likely they are to vote. Let's look at your demographic. All right, so we're seeing some increase with what we call you millennials. So you can see that you're one of the groups that's increasing in voting, and that's great. That's wonderful. You can see on the right there, Gen Z, millennials, and Gen X. So that's kind of all of us kind of put in together there. You can see huge jump in us voting, and hopefully that continues to rise. Really quickly here, eligibility and registration. You can see that there. So nothing really to surprise you there. Interesting to note that felons do lose their right to vote in some states. In Nebraska, you lose it for 2 years. And then you can see there at the bottom, you have to register to vote in Nebraska on the third Friday before the election, which I think this last time was about 25 days. But each state different with that. Some states have day of voter registration and voting. Nebraska's a little bit different. All right. You can see this here, registration laws and some issues for younger voters. So, Mr. Wood, you can kind of stop that here. You know, certainly young people, when you're in college here, you have a choice if you go out of state. But the big thing is whether you vote absentee or you're registered to vote in your new state, vote. Vote, vote, vote. This issue here, you can pause it here, Mr. Wood, to make sure the kids get all of this down. But this is some voter behavior issues. So either, number one, voting in the best interest of me. Number two and number three, looking back in terms of how I'm going to vote for someone. You can see that incumbent advantage. Looking forward and how they're going to vote for me. And then you can pause, Mr. Wood, and talk to them about that party line voting issue there. All right, how they line it up and make it easier to vote by party. Finally, then here, you can work on this in your packet to look at that chart and then do these 3 questions there on the right. End of lecture 1.